Today is February 26th, the anniversary of an event that, because of an arcane twist of history, might actually represent the beginning of time as we know it. And as time went on, things continued to happen on this day in history. The development of the modern Gregorian calendar, used in most parts of the world today, is the subject of another episode of The History Guy. But the development of a calendar as a way to account for history, that is, when events occurred, began long before the conflict between the Julian calendar and the reforms of Pope Gregory XIII. In short, to count years and the distance in years between events requires a clear reference point, and a key development in accounting for such a reference point came with the publication by the 2nd century Alexandrian mathematician and astronomer Claudius Ptolemy of his work, Almagest. The Almagest is not a calendar per se, but it does include a historical record of observations of astronomical events, going back to the beginning of reliable observation of such events. As astronomical events are predictable, such a measure allows for a reliable way to measure the passage of years. That is, it allows a frame of reference to account for the year in which an event occurs. Thus, these observations offer a timeline, a calendar of the past that allows the ability to determine, or at least approximate, when a particular event occurred. For, amongst other things, recording and canonizing astronomical observations that have been made by various astronomers over time, Almagest is considered to be one of the most influential scientific works of all time. But that accounting had to start somewhere, and that start in the Almagest is with the Babylonian record of a lunar eclipse in 747 BC in cuneiform tablets called the Babylonian Astronomical Diaries. These observations represent what was believed by Ptolemy to be the first reliable, systematic records of astronomical observations. That is, these records represent the first frame of reference that allows us to reliably count years. Prior to these observations, we know that things occurred, but we have no reliable way to determine when they occurred in the counting of years with reference to today's calendar. These observations, according to Ptolemy, began with the reign of the Babylonian emperor Nabonassar, and Ptolemy went so far as to identify the exact date of the beginning of that era, the Anno Nabonassar. That date represents essentially the beginning of measured time in subsequent calendars. The Anno Nabonassar began, Ptolemy reckons, at noon on February 26th, 747 BC. That is, the beginning of measured time occurred 2,771 years ago today. Interestingly, one impact of the Almagest was to canonize a geocentric model of the universe, the idea that the universe revolves around the Earth. Owing to Almagest, the geocentric model would hold sway in Europe, as well as the Byzantine and Islamic worlds, for some 1,200 years. But more astronomical observations would eventually challenge the geocentric model with the heliocentric model, in which the Earth and planets revolve around the Sun. While there were many great astronomers involved in the challenge, notably Nicholas Copernicus, one of the most powerful advocates of the heliocentric model was the Italian astronomer and physicist Galileo Galilei, considered the father of observational astronomy and of the scientific method. In Galileo's time, Roman Catholic teaching saw the geocentric model in religious terms, based on passages in the Bibles that suggested that the position of the earth was fixed by God. For example, Psalm 104.5, "He laid the foundations of the earth, that it should not be moved forever." Galileo, however, based on his own astronomical observations, supported the heliocentric model. While his adherence to the theory would eventually be taken before the Inquisition and result in his seclusion, he first came to the attention of the Italian Inquisition in the year 1616, the year that an inquisitorial commission officially declared heliocentrism to be heretical, since it explicitly contradicts in many places the sense of Holy Scripture. Galileo was officially ordered by officials of the Church to abandon completely the opinion that the sun stands still at the center of the world and that the earth moves, and henceforth not to be told, teach, or defended in any way whatever, either orally or in writing, on February 26, 1616. His inability to remain faithful to that pledge would lead to his conviction by the Inquisition in 1632 of being vehemently suspected of heresy and confined to house arrest for the rest of his life. But Galileo's first call before the Inquisition would not halt the course of science. On February 26, 1935, Scottish engineer Robert Watson Wyatt, already famous for developing a system to determine the location of radio transmissions, paired with his assistant, Arnold F. Skip Wilkins, to demonstrate a new technology that allowed them to use radio waves to detect the location of aircraft. Called the Daventry experiment, the two used a BBC transmitter to detect a target, Handley Page Hayford bomber. The team would receive a patent for their invention. It was the first demonstration of radio detection and ranging, otherwise known as radar. Obviously, radar has played a significant role in the development of aviation. One culmination of that development came on February 26, 1949, when the U.S. Air Force B-50 Superfortress called Lucky Lady II became the first airplane to circle the globe non-stop, the subject of another episode of The History Guy. And as February 26 represents these significant developments in science and technology, it also represents one of the United States' great projects. While construction had begun on January 5th, it was on February 26, 1933, that the official groundbreaking ceremony was held for the construction of a massive suspension bridge to connect a 1-mile strait that connects San Francisco Bay and the Pacific Ocean. The strait had been named by American explorer John C. Fremont in 1846. He called it the Golden Gate, because he wrote in his memoir, it was a golden gate to trade with the Orient. The bridge spanning it, completed in April and opened in May 1937, is called the Golden Gate Bridge. The website of the Golden Gate Bridge Highway and Transportation District said of the groundbreaking ceremony, a festive parade through the Marina District began at 12:45 p.m. Navy planes flew in formation, and engineering students carried an 80-foot replica of the bridge. Governor James Rolfe, San Francisco Mayor Angelo Rossi, and Board President William P. Filmer made speeches, and a congratulatory telegram from President Herbert Hoover was read. At 4 p.m., Major General Craig gave the right-of-way grants to Filmer, and Rossi and Filmer then turned a golden spade. An estimated 100,000 people attended the ceremony, so many that a newspaper reported the next day that 250 carrier pigeons, provided by the San Francisco Racing Pigeon Club to carry the message of groundbreaking to every corner of California, were so frightened by the surging human mass that small boys had to crawl into their compartments in the bridge replica to shoo them out with sticks. The ceremony was held in Crissy Field, which is now part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. Fitting, as the date February 26 would be particularly significant for the U.S. National Parks system. In July of 1916, a section of the Maine coast was put under the auspices of the U.S. National Park Service as Censuram National Monument by an act of President Woodrow Wilson. It was the first part of the national park system to be created from private lands that had been donated to the public. On February 26, 1919, the monument was redesignated as Lafayette National Park. It was the first U.S. national park east of the Mississippi River. Renamed Acadia National Park in 1929, the 49,000-acre park commonly called the Crown Jewel of the North Atlantic Coast received over 4 million visitors in 2021. The same day that Lafayette National Park was created, February 26, 1919, President Wilson also signed another act that redesignated a national monument into a national park, the Grand Canyon National Park Act. Now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, Grand Canyon National Park is the second most visited national park in the United States. These two designations represented significant successes for the U.S. conservation movement and the development of the national park system. That development was furthered even more in 1929. Yellowstone National Park had been established in 1872, the first national park in the United States and generally recognized as the first national park in the world. But by the 1920s, land development south of the park threatened the Yellowstone ecosystem. On February 26, 1929, following congressional approval, President Calvin Coolidge created a new park south of Yellowstone, protecting part of the Teton Mountain Range, including its tallest mountain, 13,775-foot Grand Teton, and 6 lakes at the base of the mountains to protect that land from commercial exploitation. Of course, February 26th had its significance in military history. In fact, it would lead to one of the most famous battles in history. In 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France, was defeated after his disastrous invasion of Russia in the War of the Sixth Coalition. He was forced to abdicate, stripped of his powers as Emperor of France, and exiled to the Mediterranean island of Elba in the 11 April 1814 Treaty of Fontainebleau. It was a generous agreement. Napoleon still had strong following in France, and especially among the French army. Napoleon ruled as Emperor of Elba's 12,000 inhabitants, where he instituted many reforms in a rule that is still fondly remembered by the island's inhabitants today. There were many reasons that Napoleon decided to quit Elba. Largely his ego is simply listed. However, promises of 2 million francs a year made in the Treaty of Fontainebleau were not kept by the Allies, and Napoleon faced financial insolvency on Elba. Not only did this leave his position precarious, it also convinced him that the terms of the treaty had been violated, freeing him from its obligations. On February 26, 1815, less than a year after being exiled to Elba, Napoleon engineered one of the most famous prison escapes in history, putting together a small fleet and leaving Elba for the south of France. There, Napoleon would regain the support of the French army, leading to the War of the Seventh Coalition and its final defeat at one of the most celebrated battles in history, the June 18, 1815, Battle of Waterloo. If February 26, 1815 led to one of the most famous battles of the 19th century, February 26, 1991 was the date of one of the most decisive and last battles of the 20th century. The Battle of 73 Easting was named after a map coordinate used by coalition forces in the 1990 to 1991 Gulf War. There, coalition forces met Iraqi forces in what one participant described as the last great tank battle of the 20th century. The website supportourtroops.org explains, the Iraqi Republican Guard and its Tawakalna division were dug in, taking defensive positions near grid coordinate 73 Easting, a GPS line used as a location as there are no geographic landmarks in the desert. These were Saddam Hussein's crack troops, equipped with aging Soviet T-72s and T-62s, and they were ready for a fight. At the 73 Easting coordinate, specifically 4 troops of the U.S. 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, each equipped with 9 M1A1 main battle tanks and 13 M3A2 Bradley cavalry fighting vehicles, encountered 2 armored brigades of the Iraqi army. The 2nd ACR was an advanced unit, tasked with identifying the location of enemy units and neutralizing their security forces, to allow heavier elements following them to engage the Iraqi defenses. Their task was made more difficult by a desert sandstorm that limited aerial observation. 2 ACR encountered the tanks of the Iraqi Tawakalna division, dug in a strong defensive position, but the 2 ACR had arrived on their flank. Despite being significantly outnumbered, in the ensuing battle, the 4 troops neutralized 2 Iraqi tank brigades. The website We Are the Mighty writes, the Americans cut a 5-kilometer-wide swath through the Iraqi division, and then their brothers in Ghost, Killer, and Iron troops joined the fight. By the time the U.S. stopped firing to ask for the Iraqi surrender, 1,000 Iraqi soldiers had been killed and 85 tanks, 40 armored vehicles, 30 other vehicles, and 2 artillery batteries had been destroyed. Most of the Iraqis quickly surrendered. While the extent of the battle was not well understood until after the conclusion of the conflict, the battle contributed significantly to the coalition advance. Still, some argue that the battle has received more publicity than larger tank battles in the conflict, with We Are the Mighty ranking 73 Easting as just the 3rd largest tank battle of the Gulf War. February 26 also represents dramatic changes in the United States and the relations between its people. Following the Union victory in 1864, the nation passed 3 so-called Reconstruction Amendments, meant to resolve the most significant issues that had divided the nation. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, and the 14th Amendment guaranteed equal protection under the law for all persons. But Congress realized that a key to protecting the victories won in these 2 amendments was to guarantee the franchise to black male voters. The last and perhaps most controversial of the Reconstruction Amendments, the 15th Amendment, reading, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude," was passed by Congress by only Republican votes, with no Democrats voting in favor, on February 26, 1869. It was ratified by the states and became law March 30th, 1870. February 26 would again represent a significant step when, in 1962, the United States Supreme Court ruled 9-0 in the case Bailey v. Patterson that it was unconstitutional for transportation facilities like bus and train stations to be racially segregated. The court wrote, "We have settled beyond question that no state may require racial segregation of interstate or intrastate transportation facilities." And of course, these are just a few of the events that have occurred on the date in history that might literally represent the date that history began. U.S. history itself hasn't really been the same since February 26, 1993, when at 17 minutes past noon, a bomb exploded in a van underneath the North Tower of New York's World Trade Center. It failed in its goal to bring the tower down, but it did kill 6 people in what the FBI describes on its website as something of a deadly dress rehearsal for 9/11. It seems that since humans first started observing astronomical events systematically in ancient Babylon nearly 3 millennia ago, we humans keep thinking up ways to make history. So much history. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.